Right. Okay. Yeah. Good afternoon, everyone. So in my group, so we are dealing with several types of problems. So one of them, which I'm going to talk about today, is modeling processes and interactions at interfaces, mainly driven by various applications in microelectronics and photocatalysis type of systems. So in all cases, we deal with some interfaces between different materials, which are usually semiconductors or metals and oxides, which form some interfaces and some layers. And we are always interested in defects in these systems, which are either some hampering performance of these devices and make them unreliable, or say improve performance of systems like these photocatalytical systems. So now another type of problems we are related to interaction of molecules with surfaces, which is linked to our collaboration with experimentalists using atomic force microscopy. And in this case, we look at surfaces which are shown on the left, where these bright dots, I guess you may see maybe my arrow, are representing molecules where, say, single molecules get adsorbed, or indeed self-assembled monolayers. And so we try to simulate, on one hand, adsorption, on the other hand, imaging of this adsorption using KFM in order to correlate it with experimental data. And also how these molecules get assembled, as shown on the right, into self-assembled monolayers. How do they talk to each other, including some entropic effects, also in relation to molecular electronics applications. So today I want to focus on some problems which we have with modeling degradation of amorphous films in devices. So devices, as shown on the left, say like a transistor, so they have these different electrodes, and so they consist of layers of materials like silicon, and then there is some silicon dioxide, and then there is some hafnium dioxide on top, and then maybe some electrode on top, which is, say, titanium nitride. So basically a system of very thin interfaces you can see here of the order of 1 nanometer. And so these are real devices which are powering our computers at the moment, but they basically degrade over the time. And so on the bottom, there are some graphs which show the idea of that decay. So if you apply bias to this type of system over time, so you get some degradation of oxide, which is reflected in degradation of, say, or in the current through the oxide, which is increasing. And this is what you want to avoid. So initially it is kind of what is shown at the bottom as wear out, but then you start seeing high current, which is called soft breakdown. And then you can see even high current, which is on the right, which is say hard breakdown. So at that moment, the device basically breaks, and so your computer stops working, and so that is bad. So we are trying to understand what are the mechanisms of what is happening. So it is very similar to what Jochen has been talking about, because what we're having is a system of electrodes and some electrolyte in between, which is in this case maybe some amorphous oxide, which is solid, but the processes are very similar in a way. So you can see on the right that there are, say, electrons which can tunnel or say into this silicon dioxide layer, and then hafnium dioxide, which is shown here, and then down into the electrode. Very similar way as Jochen has been describing. So if there are defects inside these oxides, then electrons may tunnel into the defect states and then tunnel into the electrode. And this is called trap-assistant tunneling, meaning that basically electrons jump between different defects, like you would jump, say, by some stones to cross a stream. So if you apply bias to operate a device, then as it says at the bottom, electrons can tunnel or say defect states. And so we are trying to understand which defects actually can be involved in this process. So basically, experimentalists and technologies, they measure current. And so we need to understand which defects can be responsible for that current. So methods which we use, say in many of these devices, these oxides are amorphous. This also gives some flexibility to these devices, so which allows them to be deposited some plastic, etc., which is kind of beneficial. But on the other hand, it introduces a lot of disorder in these systems. And so the methodology is shown here. So first of all, we need to generate these amorphous structures. So for that, we take some periodic cells, melt them, and then quench them to low temperature and produce some disordered solid system. If a material is a glass former, like silicon dioxide, then this disordered system can be a glass. And that is fine. So we can well reproduce properties of silicon dioxide, but most of the materials which we are dealing with are not good glass formers. So they are ionic systems. In that case, it is kind of frozen melt, which we are getting as a result. And so we need to understand how the properties of this frozen melt actually correspond to properties of real amorphous material. And then we look at what happens to electrons which get injected into this material. Again, very similar to what Jochen has been talking about. So there are these electrons may be delocalized, or they may localize and form some quasi-polaronic type of states, and then get trapped inside this oxide, and that is bad for performance of device. So to do that, we use molecular dynamics, mainly using lamps and some various force fields, RxFF. And so we, first of all, study the properties of these amorphous materials. And then when we have defined their properties, we put them all into CP2K in this case. And we need to, because these are amorphous systems and so they're disordered, so we need to have some statistics of what's going on, because models which we are using are not as big as Dave was talking about. So we are talking about several hundred atoms, usually below 400 atom type of periodic cells. So what we are getting is a kind of periodic amorphous system, but we have many models of these, about say several hundred usually. And then we put some, say look at some defects inside these materials, using CP2K, which is a relatively efficient code. But because we deal with oxide, we also need to use non-local functionals. And so the results so strongly depend on the functional. So therefore, that is one of part of the problems. So what we observe is that, say, when we produce such a system, like, for example, amorphous silica, and so we put some electrons in or holes, so we see some states which are partially localized. In a similar way as Jochen again was showing. So you have some partial localization. And then if we allow the system to relax, then system, say electrons or holes may localize inside. So in order to find out where these electrons or holes can localize, we use what is called inverse participation ratio method, which allows us to study the electronic structure of this material and correlate sites which are prone to localization by the behavior of the wave function to what might happen at the end. So at the bottom here, you can see what is called inverse participation ratio plot for, in this case, amorphous hafnium dioxide, which shows that actually the valence band, which is on the left of hafnium dioxide, which is built of oxygen p states. So it's prone to localization. So you can see these peaks, which show that actually there are quite strongly localized states already before any holes have been put in. So if we put holes into these states, they relax, so deform the lattice, and they get very strongly localized. We also see that in the conduction band, at the bottom of the conduction band, there are also states which are less localized, but still these tell us that actually potentially if we put electrons into the system and allow them to relax, they may also become localized. And we know what kind of states, precursor sites for this localization actually may be in the system. So we use this in order to actually find out what is happening. So we put real electrons and holes inside, relax the systems, and say find that the states which we've obtained as a result of that get localized, and so in many cases, and then you get states in the middle of the gap. And so these states are actually those where electrons can tunnel in. For example, if the states are not fully occupied or can tunnel out. And so the examples of wave functions of these type of states or electron densities are shown on the right here. You can see this very strongly localized states, which we find, for example, in Hafnia. So a couple of examples are shown in these figures here. So the states which trap electrons or holes in these systems are usually low coordinated. So because they have, these materials have distribution of coordinations as a result of disorder. And so if you have, say, disordered, for example, hafnium dioxide, so it has distribution of different coordinations, like hafnium maybe 5, 6, and 7 coordinated, and oxygen 2 and 3 and 4. And then holes, for example, will sit on 2 coordinated oxygen sides, roughly. So this is what actually we observe in this system. So the results depend on the size of the cells we use, but they converge quite quickly. So as a result, we see this type of localized states, which I don't have huge time to talk about, but say in all of these amorphous oxides, we see hole localization on oxygen p states, and in some cases also electron localization on cation states, if these are P or D metal. Then what we need to do in order to compare with experiment, we need to calculate rates for electron transfer between electrodes and these states. What we do using Marcus theory, again, very similar in many ways to what Jochen has been talking about. So we need to calculate the organization energies, and we need to calculate positions of the states. And then we collaborate with a group in Italy, where we have some code which we help to develop, which is called Ginestra in this case, which allows to put all these rates together and calculate in real time what may happen inside the device using kinetic Monte Carlo type of engine. So basically, we inject electrons into the oxide, and over time, say it gets degraded. So in this case, vacancies get formed. Electrons jump between these vacancies to another electrode. And say as time goes, maybe over several hundred minutes, we can see that actually there is some big cluster of vacancies formed, and this corresponds to breakdown. So this is roughly what we can do in this type of systems. So this is important to kind of simulate these devices. So there are lots of problems which we are very happy to collaborate on. So one is obviously the results depend as usual on functionals. And so we look at how, say, different types of functionals affect the results. And so, say, what type of non-local functionals or hybrid functionals should be used, say, in order to make reliable predictions. So that is a very important point. So recently we discovered that, say, using long-range exchange interaction is very important to reproduce these say, trapping energies of polarons in these systems to high accuracy. Another question is a kind of more generic question, how to understand these amorphous disordered systems. So these systems, say, what is the meaning of defects and vacancies in these systems? So this is not a very philosophical question. It is an important question, depends on the way how the system is grown and say what method is used for its production of the film. Another question which I'm hoping to collaborate with Jochen and other guys is electron transfer rates, because these are determining our interaction with experiment, and so we need to calculate correctly, say, how rates depend on bias, and say what are the real rates dependent on the distance between defects, etc. So these are kind of major problems which we are dealing with in this field, and so I would be happy to discuss and answer questions. Thank you.
Don't have any questions as yet, Alex. Any questions, anybody? Ah, Jochen.
Yes, nice talk, Alex. I was just wondering, what are the sort of qualitative differences between the crystalline and the amorphous um, um, results in these different structures? I mean, is the is the trapping, is this sort of different than the amorphous structure compared to the crystalline one, or is it?
Yeah, it is very different. So for example, if you take silicon dioxide and you take quartz as an example of that, there is no electron or hole trapping in quartz at all. Now, if you look at the disordered system, due to disorder, there are some fluctuations in potential which allow, say, both electrons and holes to trap actually in quite deep states. So they become small polarons. This is to some extent similar to what is happening, for example, at surfaces and in the bulk of materials of this type. So in some materials, like for example, magnesium oxide, there is no any polarons in the bulk. But if you look at nanoclusters of these materials, there is deep trapping of electrons and holes on the surfaces of these clusters because of low coordination of atoms. So these effects is a combination of electrostatics because low coordinated sites have very different electrostatic potential and polarization of the system because these electrostatics produce precursors for localization, then electrons or holes go on there, polarize, relax the system, and you get quite deep states there. And so this is very consistent picture in all oxides which we see, but in some oxides, still S-type oxides like zinc oxide or alumina, electrons still don't trap even if you have disorder. So even disorder cannot create deep enough, say, precursor sites for electrons to get trapped, but holes always get trapped in deep states.
Oh, that's interesting, yeah. And the preparation of these amorphous samples, I mean, you said you probably do the calculations on 200 amorphous samples. I mean, how much different are the results if you go from one amorphous structure to the other?
Well, that is a kind of normal statistic, right? So if you have less atoms, you have bigger fluctuations. So therefore, we need to find some balance between the size of the cell and the number of systems which we need to look at. Usually we deal with several hundred atoms in this type of systems. And so if you don't produce any statistics, I mean, you just use one cell, you cannot come up with reliable results because still fluctuations are too large. So basically you can predict that there is some very weird defect in there, but it is not reproduced in another cell. So you really need to have quite good statistics. Usually we do say something like 50 different cells, or in some cases several hundred or thousand, in order to get the right distribution of defect properties. If you have good statistics, at the end of the day, you see that it is more or less Gaussian. But if you don't do it, you may get, say, very unphysical results if you just look at one side or at one system.
Okay, thanks, Alex.